Hey adventurers, so today is September 22nd, which is known as Hobbit Day to the Tolkien community. So this is the day that I have chosen to put up this video about hobbits. My Hobbit Day video, I guess I should say. So Tolkien is, as you know, one of the most important authors to me. He's my favorite author, and his books are my favorite books. So I have a lot of love for this author and for the 2 days, so March 25th, which is Tolkien Reading Day, and September 22nd, which is Hobbit Day. So because it's Hobbit Day, I wanted to do a video centered around hobbits of some sort, and I didn't entirely know what to do one about for this year, but I got to thinking about it and I was like, you know what, I want to do a video on the origins of hobbits. And I'm sure in fact, I know there's plenty of other videos and content creators who have done this type of video, but I wanted to do one for myself, mostly so that I could go through and understand where the hobbits came from, so that I could know better for myself if I have to argue with somebody or anything like that, or give my reasons as to why I say the things that I say. So I went into this partly, yes, due to the Rings of Power TV show and them having hobbits in them, or Harfoots as they're calling them, which, yeah, I guess I'm not going to really argue with Rings of Power and say no, there shouldn't be hobbits in there, but that's basically why I started doing this video, was so that I could say, yeah, these are the reasons why I wouldn't have included hobbits in the Second Age timeline. So let's get started. I took all the information that I have in this video I took from The Lord of the Rings, specifically I believe it's called a prologue, which is best known as Concerning Hobbits, but it's Concerning Hobbits is only one section of the prologue realistically. So I took the information from the prologue, not just from the section called Concerning Hobbits. And then I also took some of the information from what is this, Appendix B, which is the Tale of Years, I believe is Appendix B. So that's where all this information is coming from. I did look through my other Tolkien books that I have to make sure that there was no other information on hobbits that I needed to know about, and I couldn't find any. I'm sure there is somewhere, and especially in the last volume of the Histories of Middle-earth, something like that, I think that's what it's called. Whatever that 12th volume of that series is, I fully expect there to be a lot more information in that one, because that one is about the people and creatures of Middle-earth or something like that. I don't have it, so I couldn't use it, and I didn't see any reference. I did some quick Googling to make sure that I wasn't missing anything, and it seems like most of the information is in The Lord of the Rings, so I'm not too worried about it. But if there is more information, absolutely add it down below in the comments. I'd love to hear more about it. So we'll get right into this video. The first thing I'd like to note, though, is that the prologue in Lord of the Rings is written from the perspective of Tolkien himself, looking back into the past. Therefore, everything should be taken in that light. That's something that a lot of people overlook, a lot of people don't realize, is that this prologue is Tolkien writing about it, saying, these are the things that I found out about this ancient era. So I'll get more into that as we go along. So as such, when he says that on page 1, paragraph 3, I will make sure that I tell you guys where all this is found so you guys can go exactly and find it as well. Page 1, paragraph 3, he says that hobbits are an unobtrusive but very ancient people. So when he says this, he is of course referring to the fact that it is in this present day of writing. That present day would be the 1900s, when he was writing this book in his writing in his world. So at the time of his writing, the hobbits were a very ancient people, and that's the perspective that he's looking at. Just as we would refer to something like ancient Rome or ancient Egypt, except that they are in fact more ancient still, as the realms of Egypt and Rome had not yet come to pass during the height of the hobbits. So this is him looking back into the past, just as we would look back into the past to Egypt, to Rome, to British Isles, wherever it might be in whatever we might refer to as ancient history. This is what he's thinking of with the hobbits and how he's treating this. So on page 2, paragraph 3, and page 3, paragraph 1. So these two paragraphs give a lot of information, and I think that I will just there's a lot here, and it's easier for me just to read it from the book than for me to try and summarize it, because you'll get a better understanding of it if I do that. So, it is plain indeed that in spite of later estrangement, hobbits are relatives of ours, far nearer to us than elves or even dwarves. Of old they spoke the languages of men after their own fashion, and liked and disliked much of the same things as men did. But what exactly our relationship is can no longer be discovered. The beginning of hobbits lies far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. only the elves still preserve any record of that vanished time. And their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own history, in which men appear seldom and hobbits are not mentioned at all. Yet it is clear that hobbits had, in fact, lived quietly in Middle-earth for many long years before other folk became even aware of them, and the world being, after all, full of strange creatures beyond count, these little people seemed of very little importance. But in the days of Bilbo and of Frodo, his heir, they suddenly became, by no wish of their own, both important and renowned, and troubled the counsels of the wise and the great. Then we go on to page 3. Those days, the third age of Middle-earth, are now long past, and the shape of all lands has been changed, but the regions in which hobbits then lived were doubtless the same as those in which they still linger, the northwest of the old world, east of the sea. Of their original home, the hobbits in Bilbo's time preserved no knowledge. So that is really the bulk of their origin right here. So we say right here, it talks about the beginning of hobbits lies far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. And then when you go to page 3, the first words on that page are those days, meaning the far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. So those days, the third age of Middle-earth, are now long past, and the shape of the lands has been changed. So that right there tells me that the origins of the hobbits lies far back in the elder days being the third age of Middle-earth. That is what he's referring to. There's some arguments that could be made to say that the elder days could encompass anything a long time ago, because that word elder, E-L-D-E-R, is another word for older. That is different, that word elder is different from Eldar, which is the Eldar days, E-L-D-A-R. That refers specifically to the time of the elves. The Eldar are what the elves are called. They're the first sons of Eru to awake, the first children of Iluvatar. So if it was the Eldar days, then that would be you could reasonably assume that meant the first age of Middle-earth. But because he specifically said those days, the third age of Middle-earth, that tells me that their origins were in the third age of Middle-earth. Then we jump down a little ways in that first paragraph on page 3, and we go to their own records began only after the settlement of the Shire, and their most ancient legends hardly look further back than their own wandering days. It is clear nonetheless, from these legends and from the evidence of their peculiar words and customs, that, like many other folk, hobbits had in the distant past moved westward. The earliest tales seem to glimpse a time when they dwelt in the upper vales of Anduin, between the eaves of Greenwood the Great and the Misty Mountains. Why they later undertook the hard and perilous crossing of the mountains into Eriador is no longer certain. Their own accounts speak of the multiplying of men in the land, and of a shadow that fell on the forest, so that it became darkened, and its new name was Mirkwood. So that right there tells you where they originated, and when they moved west. That all happens in the third age. We drop down a little ways. There's a lot more information on page 3 that is definitely worth checking out, but I'm going to skip down to the third paragraph, and this talks about the 3 different groups of hobbits, I guess, or tribes, you might say, and that would be the Harfoots, the Stores, and the Fallowhides. So the Harfoots had much to do with dwarves in ancient times, and long lived in the foothills of the mountains. They moved westward early and roamed over Eriador as far as Weathertop, while the others were still in Wilderland, the others meaning the Stores and the Fallowhides. They were the most normal and representative variety of hobbit, and far the most numerous. They were the most inclined to settle in one place, and longest preserved their ancestral habit of living in tunnels and holes. So their ancestral habit was to live in tunnels and holes. That's a very important note to knowing who these characters are. The Stores lingered long by the banks of the great river Anduin, and were less shy of men. They came west after the Harfoots, and followed the course of the Loudwater southwards, and there many of them dwelt between Tharbad and the borders of Dunland before they moved north again. So the Stores dwelt along the banks of the river Anduin. The Fallowhides, the least numerous, were a northerly bunch. They were more friendly with elves than the other hobbits were, and had more skill in language and song than in handicrafts, and of old they preferred hunting to tilling. They crossed the mountains north of Rivendell and came down the river Horwell. In Eriador they soon mingled with the other kinds that had preceded them, but being somewhat bolder and more adventurous, they were often found as leaders or chieftains among clans of Harfoots or Stores. Even in Bilbo's time, the strong Fallahide-ish strain could still be noted among the greater families, such as the Tooks and the Masters of Buckland. So that gives you a sense of each of the three different tribes of hobbits and how they thought, who they were, where they came from, that type of thing. Like I mentioned, page 3's got a lot of very good info on who the hobbits are and where their origins came from. So then we know this because of the Tale of the Years written out in Appendix B, that in 1050 of the Third Age, that is when we first gain record of the Perianath, or the hobbits, moving to the west, moving over the Misty Mountains essentially. So that's when we start to have a record of their existence essentially. Before then we know that they lived between Greenwood the Great and the what was that exact phrase? Between the eaves of Greenwood the Great and the Misty Mountains. So that's a large section for the hobbits to live in. So on page 4, paragraph 1, it explains that they moved into the Shire area, or Eriador, during the Third Age, when there was still some remnant of the Northern Kingdom. Those are described as these early days in paragraph 3. It was in these early days, doubtless, that the hobbits learned their letters and began to write after the manner of the Dunedain, who had in their turn long before learned the art from the elves. So that there's some information in there that's unnecessary. Basically, the necessary part is that those are the early days. This reinforces the idea that hobbits aren't as ancient as humans or elves, and that it was in those days that they forgot whatever their original language was and started using Westron, which is also known as the Common Tongue. In Appendix F, it is stated that there is no record of any language peculiar to hobbits. In ancient days, they seemed always to have used the languages of men near whom or among whom they lived, which allowed them to switch to common speech easily once they entered Eriador. So they already knew the tongues of men, and that's the tongues that they used. So when they came into Eriador, they adapted and started to use the Common Tongue, or the Westron. The land that would become known as the Shire is, in the year 1601 of the Third Age, granted to the hobbits by Argileb II. This is one of the kings of Arnor. That's the Northern Kingdom. And many hobbits, led by Marcho and Blanco, two Fallowhide brothers, take up residency therein. That therein being the area that would later become known as the Shire. This is yet 300 years before the line of northern kings comes to an end with the death of Ardvedui. So, they're 300 years before the complete collapse and fall of the Northern Kingdom is when the hobbits move into the Shire. At page 5, paragraph 2, at no time had hobbits of any kind been warlike, and they never fought amongst themselves. So, the hobbits were never a warlike race. They were never people who went to war, who liked to battle as the dwarves and the men and the elves did. Whether or not they enjoyed battle is debatable. Those are the races, but they were not people who went to war very often. There were some times that they went and fought battles. It mentions that it talks specifically about the Battle of Greenfields in Shire Reckoning 1147, which would be 1747, I believe, of the Third Age. If I'm doing my math correctly there, or sorry, 2747 of the Second Age, or 2747 of the Third Age. So there is a battle then. They also talk about a battle where the hobbits claim to have sent archers north to fight with the men during the battle against Angband and the Witch King of Angmar and that whole realm. The hobbits claim to have sent warriors, archers specifically, to fight there, but there's no record of that in the recordings of man. And then page 6, paragraph 2, it mentions that all hobbits had originally lived in holes in the ground, or so they believed, and in such dwellings they still felt most at home. But in the course of time they had been obliged to adopt other forms of abode. So this is just saying this is their origin, that they originally, at least to what they believe and what they can recall and everything, they believe that they originally lived in holes in the ground, much like we know and love them for doing in the end of the Third Age. So that is really all that we have to say all that we have to know about the origins of the Hobbits. So we know that their oldest tales tell of the time when they were between Mirkwood and the Misty Mountains, before it was Mirkwood. They moved because it was becoming foul and dark and evil and becoming Mirkwood, and so that's when they moved. We also know that the first instance of them coming into the recordings of man was in 1050 of the Third Age, which is 1,050 years into the Third Age, which a Hobbit lives to roughly 100 years on average, so that's easily 10 plus generations of Hobbits, probably closer to 15 to 20 generations of Hobbits, very easily, maybe even more than that. So that's a lot of Hobbits to come before the beginning of the Third Age. And so it's believable, very easily believable to me, that if they are truly related to men, as it seems they most likely are, that in that 1,050 years, the separation between man and hobbits grew more and more stark, and you knew that more and more. I didn't go into a lot of the words used, like hobbit and hobbitla and everything. That's unnecessary for this purpose of the origin of hobbits. But they seem to be human in origin, and slowly over time this became their own, not even race, but their own subspecies of human, I guess. And so in 1050 of the Third Age is when they first came into records, human records, and since then that's all we know about them. But it seems likely that they were around before that, obviously, because you don't just appear in the records if you haven't existed already. It's kind of a little bit confusing the way that I just worded that, probably, but that's how things work. So they existed in the Third Age. That was their origin, made clear by all this, the Elder Days, and then those days being the Third Age of Middle-earth. What is it? It says, lies far back in the Elder Days that are now lost and forgotten. Those days, the Third Age of Middle-earth. So that, to me, makes it as clear as can be that their origins was in the Third Age of Middle-earth. I don't really need to go more into that, I don't think. I think I've made my point clear, and that is what I believe of the origins of the Hobbits. So, thank you guys for watching an Erudite Adventure. Hopefully this was an informative video, hopefully that you were able to learn something from it, or understand why you believe what you believe about the Hobbits. That's really all I've got to say. Thank you guys for watching. We will post thank you guys for watching. We post videos every Monday and Thursday, and have our social medias linked in the description down below. Stay warm.